Hello, my name is Neale van Stralen, and I'll be discussing the paper Feature Specialization and Clustering Improves Hierarchical Subtask Learning. And I'd like to acknowledge the collaborators on this work, Seung Kim, Hui Tran, and Girish Chowdhury. The main motivation behind this work is the human's ability to decompose very complex problems into more manageable subtasks to improve the learning process. Take the game of capture the flag on the right, where the blue agent must go and capture the enemy team's red flag while simultaneously defending its own flag. A human is able to look at this problem and quickly identify potential subtasks which can solve the environment, such as going back and defending its flag, going off and engaging isolated enemies, or sneaking around the enemies and going directly for the flag. And the main benefit of this type of representation that it simplifies exploration of the state space over traditional RL methods, which would only use primitive actions such as moving left, down, up, or right to solve this game. Additionally, these subtask representations are generally more flexible and generalizable to small changes in the environment, such as an enemy's position changing. And the main question of hierarchical reinforcement learning is how can one quickly identify these subtasks? And this problem is often framed in the semi-Markov decision process, where in an MDP, one navigates between these different states to their goal location, whereas a semi-Markov decision process, one identifies only the key states that they must navigate to, and then they define options which navigate between those key states. And so there are many ways to identify what these options are. One class of methods use exploration to identify these options, and they learn options which navigate to diverse states in the environment. However, they don't learn other subtasks such as navigating to important strategic positions or performing complex movements to interact with enemy agents, limiting performance in some types of games. On the other hand, there are also decomposition-based methods to generate options. These types of methods learn options by learning a representation of the environment, say a Laplacian or the successor feature representation, and decomposing those representations to identify the options. In literature, this decomposition is generally done with eigendecomposition, which is related to minimum cuts in graph theory. And these generally identify corners or doorways in the environment, which generally have strategic value. However, similar to the exploration-based options, they don't identify options that perform complex movements in the environment. And also, both of these methods don't identify options which interact with complex enemy agents or dynamic changes in the environment. So to improve this, we have three major contributions of this paper. We propose a split successor feature encoding to create options that interact with dynamic elements of the environment, such as adversaries in Capture the Flag. We also introduce dueling successor features to learn more accurate environment representations to analyze and decompose. And finally, we propose, instead of eigendecomposition, using cluster-based decompositions to create options that cover more of the environment dynamics. So our work is based off of the decomposition-based methods, and we use successor features to model the environment. And so successor features is a method to separate the rewards and dynamics of an environment, and we can encode the dynamics through a variety of different ways. The original implementation is based off of successor representation, where we encode the dynamics in this M variable. And this effectively models, given my current state and action, what states do I expect to see in the future? And we can independently assign rewards to each of those states. So we can reparameterize the Q function as, given my current state and action, what states do I expect to see in the future? And which of those states will give me a reward? And so we've separated the dynamics and the rewards of the environments. The extension of this is successor feature, which extends this problem with neural networks and eliminates the need for a tabular memory. We instead parameterize each of those states with a feature representation phi. And so now this becomes, given my current state, which features in the environment do I expect to see in the future? And similarly, we can assign reward or value to each of those features. Building off successor features, we propose using feature specialization in that phi latent space. And this is inspired by mammalian brains, which contain specialized clusters of neurons, which model important objects in the environment, such as food, predators, or obstacles, and drive interactions with those features. In our paper, we propose a generalized architecture that operates within the MDP framework, where you're only provided with state and reward observations. We use the state observations to encode spatial information of the environment, such as the walls or the open rooms or the doorways in the 4 rooms environment. And we use the reward feedback to learn more important objects in the environment, such as flags or dynamic enemies, as we assume that these specific objects in the environment are generally incorporated with reward. Once we have defined our features, we actually need to learn the dynamics of the environment with successor features to learn psi. And this is traditionally done with a temporal difference-like update, as it's very similar to Q functions. However, similar to Q functions, this often results in overestimation of those features, i.e. overestimation of the value function, which results in a very poor representation when we in turn want to decompose it. So we propose using a dueling architecture similar to the dueling Q networks proposed in previous literature to help reduce the overestimation from the temporal difference updates in psi, which models our dynamics. Once we have modeled our dynamics, we now turn to decomposing those dynamics and creating options. So we do this with principal component analysis, where the principal components actually represent the cluster centroid subspace of the dynamics. And so what this practically means is the first several principal components actually are the main state clusters in the environment. So in 4 rooms, this would identify clusters for each of the 4 different rooms. And you would identify options that lead to those different rooms. Additionally, subsequent principal components are actually intra-cluster, defined intra-cluster interactions in the subspace. And what that means is they actually define movements within those clusters. So it can define movements within a specific room, say from the right side of a room to the left side of a room. And so once we have generated those options, we insert them into a hierarchical reinforcement learning framework, where a hierarchical controller decides when to use those specific options in order to solve the environment. And the way we've structured this is that the hierarchical controller can operate with any classic RL algorithm. And in our experiments, we use proximal policy optimization as the hierarchical controller. Now, discussing some of the results of our paper, we've experimented in 3 different environments. Our first environment was the 4 rooms environment, a basic benchmark for hierarchical reinforcement learning. What we found is that our method improves over all of the other option generation methods we've discussed earlier, and results in some very interesting options. So as I was saying earlier, the options are related to the clusters subspace of this. So we see that the first options learn high-level clusters in the environment, say the right side of the room or individual rooms, and subsequent elements in that subspace identify intra-cluster movement. For example, this third policy down here moves from the right-hand side to the left-hand side of this top right room. Also within the 4 rooms environment, we identified the impact of our dueling successor feature representation on how we model the environment. Looking at this in the 4 rooms environment, any state action combination that results in the same state should have the same dynamic psi representation. And what we see in classic successor features is that it's actually very noisy and interdispersed and entangled with other states, which creates problems when decomposing. Whereas with our dueling successor feature, these are more neatly clustered. Next, we experimented in a capture the flag game where one agent competes against two enemy agents. And we see that because our method identifies options that interact with those dynamic enemies, we see significant performance improvements over the baselines that we experimented against. And so looking at the options we generate from this, because we split the feature encoding space into spatial and object, we create spatial-based options, which are agnostic of the enemy position in the environment and always navigate to the particular locations, in this case, going always to the top right-hand corner of the environment, where our object-based options more heavily interact with the enemy agents, such as this one, where if the enemy is on the top side of the map, navigates to this top right-hand corner, which limits the ability of the enemy to go through the bottleneck at the top of the environment. Whereas if the enemy is on the bottom, it wants the highest value states are at the bottom to block off this choke point here. And as an aside, we can look at what the feature specialization is actually doing in our representation. And we see that our object-based features are learning what we'd expect, features and they activate near the enemy agent. And interestingly, we found several of these features that activate on the red side of the map, which gives combat advantage to the enemy agents, and it's actually tied to the reward. Our spatial-based features, on the other hand, generally activate near walls, such as this one, where it activates near a wall regardless of enemy position, similar to boundary cells in mammalian hippocampus. Or some of these activate in regular firing patterns, where this one activates in 3 specific locations, regardless of where the enemy position is, similar to place cells, which are theorized to help with navigation in mammals. Finally, we experimented on the Atari environment, which is a much more complicated game than Capture the Flag and has a much larger state space. And what we found is that while we do improve performance short term, our method is actually limited by the exploration in the environment, where we only explore a small subset of the states in the environment, and we don't produce a detailed enough representation to cover the entire environment and generate options for that. So just to summarize the contributions of this paper, we introduced 3 new architectures to improve the ability of option generation. First, we introduced a split architecture to create options that interact with dynamic enemies. We introduce a dueling successor feature method to improve the successor feature modeling of an environment. And we also propose using PCA decomposition to generate options. And so some future work of this to build off of this is we could improve the exploration to recover more detailed SF representations of the environment to decompose, as well as looking into more complex architectures for feature extraction in generalized state environments. So if you have any question about this work, feel free to email us at the email provided in this slide. And I'd like to thank you for listening.